Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 20th episode of AI and Real Life. Everyone is so excited. No coincidence. We should just mention that we come out today. It was scheduled way before the happening, which is the AI Act finally coming into force. So, if there's any coincidence, it was not intentional on our part. And we are so ecstatic to welcome Sue Turner, who has been so gracious with her time, and she's joining us from the United Kingdom. And just thank you so much for being here with us. And I so look forward to today's episode.
It's a pleasure. Thank you very much for inviting me on today.
Yeah, yeah, welcome, Sue. I just wanted to do a quick introductions, and then we'll go over our kind of main talk points today that we'll center our discussion around. So Sue's career has been dedicated to supporting and promoting the best of the British entrepreneurialism and shifting power to help disadvantaged people improve their lives. And in 2021, Sue was awarded the OBE for services to social justice. And as well as she obtained the Master of Science degree in Artificial Intelligence and Data Science at the University of Hull. And as experienced chair, non-executive director, board advisor, Sue inspires and supports boards to use artificial intelligence and data for profit and social impact. And Sue is very passionate about ensuring disadvantaged people and communities benefit from AI. And without further ado, Sue, take it away.
Okay, thank you very much for having me along today. So we're going to talk about some really interesting things, just this perspective of what is AI governance. As you say, Elena, really fortuitous that the EU AI Act coming into force today is really helping people focus on that. And for some people, they thought the governance piece of AI was kind of frippery that you could just ignore and didn't really matter. And now when there are potentially huge fines for getting things wrong with using AI tools, if they're particularly high risk and you get it wrong in the EU, then that is making people think, oh, perhaps there's more to this than just some side issue that I can ignore. So perhaps, should we start by talking about what we actually mean by AI governance and all the different ways that we can think about that? Good starting point for me is the company that I set up back in 2020 is called AI Governance. So why I picked that name was because I was thinking about how could I help people understand these tools and understand the difference that they were going to make. And I did some research which showed that 58% of boards had nobody on them who understood what AI was, let alone had ideas about how they might use it. And 91% of organizations had no controls on their AI use. So that's why the company was born, because I recognize that these tools are incredibly powerful and they are shifting power dramatically to a tiny number of people and organizations. And that really worries me, that we are putting power in the hands of organizations that may not think about the wider impacts of what they're doing. So that's why I created the company all those years ago. Thinking more broadly about what we mean about AI governance, I mean, you'll have views as lawyers on this, I'm sure, but the starting point, of course, is the legal and regulatory side.
I was just gonna say, Sue. So that means you were interested in AI governance way before it became cool, Because I mean, Alicia and I, we're relatively fresh in this whole new field. Me, I've just been only kind of deep diving for the past 2 years now, and still, it's literally dog years, as I keep saying to everyone, right? It's 1 year just times 7 at this point. But I mean, has just as usual, totally veering off script. But do you think, from your perspective, so it's been 6 years, have things changed in terms of how people perceive or how they view AI governance? In terms of just has it become more of a real concept for them? Something that they're really thinking about as businesses.
Yeah, I think the honest answer is for some, and there's still some that are ignoring it. So I was at an event recently and somebody said to me, well, how many fintech companies have you got amongst your client list? And I said, honestly, none, because they are focused on making money, shitloads of money, enormous amounts of money. And that's not a bad thing, because when companies make profits, they get taxed on those profits, and that tax goes back into society to support the things that we all want society to support. So it's not a bad thing. But it does mean they've not got their eye on the ball of the different impacts that they could be having, and they're not thinking about their responsibility and the choices that they could make. So when I started out in this line, people, when they talked about AI governments, were really focused on AI ethics, and it was an academic subject, and it wasn't really stuff that many people cared about in the real world. But slowly, people who are doing AI in different organizations responsible for data just started to get to grips with it and get interested. And there's a responsible AI summit. I mean, we'll come on to that term later on. What is responsible AI? What do we mean by it? There's a responsible AI summit in London for the first time last year. It's going to be repeated again in September this year. And I went into the room last year, and about, I don't know, 100, 150 people went, my people, I found my people. Here we are, we're actually in the same room together. And it was great to actually find that there are people who are equally, if not more, passionate than me about this subject.
The fact that you get to connect with so many people who are, as like you said, as equally passionate about this, and it's just it's worth it for me, 100%. We have you here, so that's kind of how we met anyway. But that's a totally different story. So yeah, I'm so sorry. Back to back to our discussion.
Yeah, I mean, so we sort of look at some of the legal side of governance, because I guess for me it splits into the legal and regulatory side, the practices and processes, and then the ethics. Those sort of grey areas and choices that we make. So legal and regulatory is really interesting. I mean, go back 4 years when I was starting out in this field, and we were having to interpret rules that were put there for other purposes, obviously intellectual property, GDPR, consumer protection, those sorts of rules, and figure out how they related to AI. And in some senses, we've not really come that far in many jurisdictions, because it's still a question of trying to apply other law for these purposes. And when you think about legal systems, the US and the UK legal systems are common law based. So our legal systems work like that. We take a precedent, we take a judicial decision from the past and try to apply it to something that's happening now and going into the future. And that can mean that our courts can be quite flexible and accommodate changes in society, things like technology like AI coming along. But it's slow, really, really slow. And the changes in technology, of course, are just happening at this crazy rapid rate. You compare that with the EU, which is civil law based, primarily operates on written codes, and hence their approach with the EU AI Act to try and codify the whole thing and understand what the different tools and techniques are and how they fit into this very rigid hierarchy of the risks that they might be causing, and therefore the rules that apply to them. And that's it works in the EU to a certain extent, but my worry is it's not going to work as new technology comes along, and it's just not going to be a flexible enough system.
Only time will tell, right? But
yeah,
at least they try to make it as flexible as possible. Obviously there will be amendments, and the threshold can be worked out as well. But I mean, we have still a long way to go in terms of just even determining the impact of this whole piece of very comprehensive piece of legislation. So I mean, but it's only fair to say it's really unprecedented, and it's the first of its kind, and nobody really knows where it's gonna end up. But I'm being optimistic, so I'd rather we have something like this, just nothing.
Yeah, I think you're right. We have to be optimistic, but I find it tough for clients when they're saying, "Okay, what do I do?" And we're saying, well, here's the set of rules, but the guidance on it hasn't actually been created yet. And some areas, the guidance is only going to be created a few weeks before actual parts of the EU Act come into play in 2025 and 2026. So that's really tough when you're trying to plan a business today and figure out your AI use case, and you just don't know if it's going to fit or not fit. So I can't blame some businesses for saying, well, actually, we'll concentrate on the markets, the big market, obviously, in the United States, the smaller market, but hopefully a vibrant market in the UK, and just opt out of trying to conform with the EU until it all becomes clearer. So that's a sensible approach, a pragmatic approach to take when you just don't know what the future looks like.
No, 100%. The case in point, the latest Llama 3.1, right? Because they announced that they're not going to roll it out in the EU. It's just they don't want to risk it. It's too big of a risk for them. So, and it's too many unclear points on that. So just
Yeah.
they certainly not the last ones. So
No, that's right. And I think because there's so many other markets to play in, that could disadvantage EU. And of course, there's some really strong companies that are based in the EU, and they will no doubt be influencing the way the various guidance are set up. And that to me is a worry as well, that we're going to get big tech companies really on the forefront because they can pay people to be part of the various working groups that are being set up now and get involved in the EU AI Act guidance and framing things. So we're going to get inevitably that regulatory capture where big tech designs things that suit big tech. So smaller companies, civil society organizations, public sector organizations are not going to get so much of a chance. Well, that's wrong. Sorry, I'll correct myself. We have a chance. We do have a chance because the EU is being very open about saying, come and join these working parties, come and submit your views, which is fantastic. I was looking at one of the working parties yesterday and thinking, oh, I really ought to get involved. And I sat down and I started sort of writing out what I would do and how I'd get involved and how much time it was going to take. And I thought, I can't afford to give that amount of time. And so I didn't apply to be on that group. And I think a lot of people who aren't employed at big companies will be in that same position. And we've got to get our voices heard in a different way that doesn't compromise our day-to-day responsibilities for clients and earning a living and all those good things.
yeah, no, 100%. I mean, I could only hope that these small contributions that we do bi-weekly sort of count to some extent, and just it's a different way of expressing your voice. And I mean, however big the platform is, I'm happy that we have it, and we are welcoming all different types of opinions, and at least something we can do. I would say small contribution on our part.
Yeah, no, that's right. We each have to get involved as we can. I mean, I was looking the other day at in the United States the NIST risk management framework approach, and it's kind of hard for ordinary leaders in organisations to follow. And there was one that I was looking at on 12 risks have been identified of generative AI use, which is kind of sensible and manageable number. But then this consultation is looking at over 400 potential mitigations. You think if you're not an AI expert and you're trying to get your head around 400 mitigations that you might need to look at for implementing your generative AI use, you're not going to bother, are you? You're just going to give up on number 22 because you haven't got time, perhaps haven't got the knowledge, and you've certainly got a million other calls on your working hours rather than just working your way through all 400 of them.
Yeah, it's like a full-time job. Sounds like it.
Yeah, very much so. Very much so.
Yeah, I'm curious too. I mean, in the US, as you mentioned, National Institute for Standards and Technology, the NIST, the famous one. So, is there like equivalent like that in the UK or some sort of institution that is very respectable? Because I know that this NIST AI framework, this is something that people, have been looking into to just even start. Like, where would they start with their AI governance program in their organization? So what are the institutions in the UK that businesses or compliance professionals would look up to for this kind of guidance?
Yeah, so in the UK, the previous government that we changed just to less than a month ago now, they said they wanted to have a very light touch approach to regulating AI across the UK. And so they were asking people to, get involved and just sort of figure things out for themselves and, be innovative and creative. And they asked different regulators to take a lead on trying to shape some of the controls. But they didn't really set up anything substantial apart from an AI Safety Institute. Now, that's the one that, in theory, organizations who are creating these foundation models, large language models, will submit their model to for testing. So there'll be some transparency there. But it's not staffed yet. It doesn't really do its job yet. So we're yet to see how that's going to shape up and whether the different regulators are going to start giving more advice and more information out to individual businesses. When I'm working with clients and they say, give me some sort of framework that I can work within to put my governance together, I'll quite often point them to standards. Particularly, there's ISO 42001. So obviously, not specific to the UK, it's global, but it's really clear and it's written in language that isn't difficult to get your head around. And there's an appendix in there, Appendix B, if anybody wants to look at it, which is really straightforward just to run through. Should I be using various different techniques and government practices in my organization when I'm thinking about how I manage my AI system? So there are some tools like that I think are really good and clear. But no, the UK in itself hasn't set up just one body. We've got the Alan Turing Institute. They do some really interesting work, and they've got some great free guidance. They've got courses and so on, which help people understand about AI ethics, for example, and some of those principles. Again, you've got to be a bit nerdy like me to spend the time working through those. It's not a kind of an easy checklist that you can just grab off the shelf and start applying.
Yeah.
So in terms of,
oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was just gonna kind of add up, piggyback on that, the standards part of thing. But when it comes to the UK, Sue, you must have heard about the algorithmic transparency recording standard, right? Because that was kind of floated at some point, and I think back in April there were last discussions and updates on that. So where the foundation model developers needed to actually do the document everything, everything that comes into training of the model, how it works, what is it for? Essentially, what it creates is a record, kind of this a living, updatable record keeping thing, right? Which kind of acts to some extent as a standard as well. So during all the life cycle of the AI model, how it works, has it been decommissioned and stuff like that. That's kind of keeps being updated. Do you know kind of what's the status on this, or I don't know?
Yeah, so the algorithmic transparency recording standard, it's out there, and public sector organizations are encouraged to use it to log what they're doing with AI. Actually, there's only 9 examples that have been logged on that system. 9 across the whole of the UK since it was started operating in, I think, about middle of 2022, so 4 years ago. None of those ones that have been logged are using foundation models. So they're all, good old-fashioned AI, machine learning, and so on. And I suppose it's fairly typical for how it was put together. Standards, when they're forged in a vacuum, designed by people who are technocratic, working in their own little world, don't always work in the real world. And I think that's what's happened with that algorithmic transparency recording standard, is that, it's nice intention, but it should have had more people involved in creating it who understood the realities of how these tools were being used in different organizations, and how lacking many organizations in the public sector are of people who can just spend the time to keep those records up to date. And of course, as I said, it was set up in 2022, so in the era before large language models hit the streets. Is it appropriate for the way those models work? Maybe. It's quite prescriptive in the detail that you've got to fill in, but the fact that nobody has recorded a use of an LLM on that documentation perhaps speaks volumes. And as I say, there's only 9 examples out there, so it's nice in theory, but it's not exactly changing the world.
Yeah, and also, I mean, it's obviously it's a problem, and it's a widespread at that we don't really have the data or any reliable information, any solid information on how those systems and AI models are used in the wild, sort of, right? In the public sector, or be it the private sector, it doesn't matter. Until we get a clear understanding of how they are being used, how can we improve what we have right now? How can we better mitigate the risks? How we can work on the standards that are universally acknowledged. Yes, NIST and OECD principle and ISO. These are all good, but still there has to be more, I would say, agreement on the standards and on even definitions of what AI is and all this stuff, because we are all over the place. Literally, depending on the type of regulation and the jurisdiction, everything varies to an extent, and this is not helping at all.
No, I think that's right. And there are very few standards that guide people. So I'll give you an example from my own work. I have one client, which is a business, and a very well-intentioned business. They're purpose-driven. They are very focused on the impact they have on society and doing the right thing for society. So heart's very definitely in the right place. So they set up their own ChatGPT instance and asked me to come in and not audit it because there's no standards to audit against, but to review what they've done and think about it from the AI governance perspective. What could they have done differently? What could they do better? So even though they got into it using good tools and techniques and with the right intentions, I still found 20 areas for improvement. That's really quite significant. And then some of them were small, but some of them were potentially quite awkward for the organization if things had gone wrong because they didn't have the right governance in place. So that just shows where, as leaders in organizations, people are quite often trying to do the right thing, but they're having to make their own way. And that means that we're reliant on complex areas like ethics. That's those grey areas. Are we making a good choice? 50% in the UK, 50% of small to medium-sized companies haven't, not small to medium companies, FTSE registered companies, so listed businesses, 50% of them don't have a published code of business ethics, let alone a published code of AI ethics. So they're really starting from scratch in a lot of cases to figure out what is ethics, what are we comfortable with? And most leaders haven't had training in it. My daughter's doing a business and management degree at the moment, and she is having training in every one of her modules about ethics. When I did my master's in AI and data science, we had training in every module about ethics. But the vast majority of people leading organizations today haven't had that sort of training. So how do they know even to spot the grey areas where they're having to make ethical choices, let alone have some sort of code which guides them and helps them making those choices? So to give you an example, we could predict, and one of my clients is predicting which employees are most likely to leave. They're trying to reduce their attrition rate. They want to keep people in the business. So they put together lots of different data sets, and they built a model which does predict which people are most likely to leave the organization. How do the employees feel about this? Well, they haven't been asked. Nobody's gone through that process of saying we could do this, but should we do it? Another example recently in the UK, our tax authority, Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs, they recruited somebody into the organisation purely by online interviews and automated processes. So the candidate joined the organisation never having met a human being and talked to a human being. Potentially very, very productive use of the resources of the organisation. But going back to where I started, it's shifting power away from the candidate to the employing organisation, because the candidate never has a chance to think, do I want to work here? Do I like these people? What's the culture of this organisation? So again, ethical choice being made there by the organisation to use that, but they probably didn't realise they were making an ethical choice. And another example, last example yesterday, from the Financial Times, there was an article about airports in India that are using facial recognition technology to do away with boarding cards, for example. Only after it's been implemented are they saying they're going to actually get their house in order and be transparent about what they're doing. Oh dear, that's kind of basic, isn't it? If you're going to use something like that, you need to be consulting up front and thinking about transparency. But as I say, leaders haven't got guidance on this, so they're making mistakes.
Exactly. And usually what's missing, first of all, is, like you mentioned, is the infrastructure, right? It's the basic absence of, first of all, for a company, just even basic ethical principles just for this company, right? Nobody's talking about AI. Nobody's jumping like straight like 10 levels up, but just the absence of this is what kind of that's the main bottleneck, I think, for me, especially when we're talking about third world countries, right? The basic absence of access to Wi-Fi or to computers, to hardware and stuff like that. I mean, all those countries, and especially when we're talking about the global south, right? And Alicia and I, went during the United Nations conference a few weeks back. That's what they were talking about. Specifically, the focus was on the global south when the discussion was in terms of we need to stop because a lot of those countries, what they do is just copy pasting the existing legislation from the westernized right society, and they just just implement it that way without making any changes whatsoever, which is just ridiculous. And a lot of the times what happens is it's just, I would say, like an experiment to a point. Those countries are just being experimented on in terms of just what's gonna work, what's gonna stick or not, because it's a totally whole ball game out there in terms of how things work.
Mm.
what are the laws, and what is the the cultural background and all of that. None of this is being considered
Yeah,
sometimes.
and the cultural dimension is so important, isn't it? It isn't one size fits all. Different countries, different cultures, different ways of doing things should be respected when it comes to lawmaking. And that's one of my concerns when we're thinking about the big issues, things like existential risk. It's all very sexy and very exciting, and people want to talk about it. Great. But should there just be one size fits all? Can we accommodate different use cases, different cultures? And the UN, I think, does some great work. The Tech for Good conference that takes place in Geneva is fascinating. And I remember one example from there of an AI app that had been created for use by farmers in Kenya. And because it had been organized and created bottom up, talking to the farmers, it had adapted to the way they work. So they didn't have smartphones. They couldn't afford to have data always on. So rather than creating a system that was sending data every minute of the day from a smartphone, no, the device the whole system was created to work off dumb phones and just send the data in very short bursts once a day. And that worked for the farmers. It wasn't using their data in ways that they couldn't cope with. It didn't demand they went out and get a new phone. So the system worked because people had listened to the people on the ground and built things bottom up. And there's not enough of that going on, that sense of big tech, let's devise something. Oh, it works brilliantly for 60% or 80% of the world. And let's ignore the 40 to 20% of the world it doesn't work for. That's wrong. We've got to design things that work for 100% of people, whatever their culture, whatever their abilities, whatever their data and technology access.
Precisely. I believe in the future where we have different types of mini language models. They're precisely trained on like every dialect whatsoever, whatever you need. It's just kind of has this distinct cultural aspect of things. And I mean, why should we have just one llama 3.1 for the whole of the world? It's unattainable, it's unsustainable, and the basis for this is just wrong to begin with. So it might be good for some people, but it's totally bad for other people.
Yeah, but if we're going to train models on material, whether it's language or other artifacts from different cultures, we should reward those cultures for participating in that, because there are some indigenous people who've actually said, no, we don't want models to be trained on our language and our culture, because you're taking that away from us. So that brings into focus this idea of the data trust. So to be able to set up around the world data trust so that data is protected, it can be accessed for a fee by organizations that can prove they meet certain ethical standards. And then those fees are harvested and gathered and put into a permanent endowment. So rather like the Norwegian sovereign wealth funds have done with money from the oil and gas sector, creating a massive fund which is there to do all sorts of things. And potentially you could set up a wealth fund for a data trust to give value back to those indigenous people forever. Rather than taking and again shifting power to the big tech companies, we keep some power then with the people whose culture, whose language it is that gets absorbed into those models. Now, that's an idea that I've posited with people in the House of Lords and the House of Commons here in the UK, and Lord Holmes, who's really active on lots of things in the House of Lords in the UK, has said we need a cultural shift in how we perceive and value data. But at the moment, nobody's really taking up this idea of data trusts and pushing it forward. And I wish they would here in the UK, because we need a national debate about what data is worth sharing, and then how we allow access to it, and how we use potentially the fees, the income from that, for social good.
Yeah, I agree. Hopefully this little discussion will just, jumpstart some, at least even if it's maybe in the comment section, that's good enough for me. 'Cause we already have kind of a few comments on just the standards and a few other things. So we can get back to them if you want at some point. But, yeah.
Yeah, do flag up any that I'm missing. Yeah, absolutely. Should we move on to Lisa?
Yeah. So thank you for bringing up the data trust concept. It's a very interesting one, because ultimately, and I think we've heard people talk about it, is because, it's kind of funny to say that it's kind of difficult to comprehend, but I think we will be running out of training data at some point, because I think the models are consuming on the internet as we speak, and doing that in a very fast pace. So, and at this time, it's really a wild west out there right now with the data being consumed and what kind of data. And there's this concept in computer science, garbage in, garbage out, where I think can also play into. So this concept of the data trust is really interests me, because even from, I guess, from the legal perspective, I mean, there's so many debates right now how all of this should be licensed. I mean, who owns the IP? If there is, if it's if this content is even protected, from the intellectual property standpoint, and the data. So it's going to be very interesting if this idea takes off, then where you can actually create those repos, the repositories of this vetted data. Who's going to vet it? Who's going to audit? Who's going to take care of it? Who's going to secure it? And how it's going to be licensed, and whether the businesses can afford it? Because again, but I think it's a very interesting concept. Specifically, as you said, for some of the indigenous cultures as well. So if they want to, do not want for LLMs to be trained on their language and their data. To me, this is something that I guess we're going to see if this is going to work, and if people are going to be interested in this, or it could be potentially a moneymaker for some. But again, if it's going to be owned by the government, or it's going to be vetted by the government, or some sort of like institution, or like oversight committee, or some sort of like body that's going to regulate all of that. So or at some point that we're going to have to create synthetic data and have models trained on that. But again, how that's going to transpire. I mean, this entire conversation actually reminds me of the early days of the open source kind of software, and right now we do have guidelines and principles and common practices and things like that around open source movement and open source software development. But there were days where people, just really kind of went with the flow, what was working, what was not working, and just kind of moving forward. So this entire, because right now many organizations have like open source compliance, programs and governance, and offices. But at this time, it reminds me of that time when it was in the beginning stages of that, compliance work. And the same with kind of AI governance, how you're gonna, wrap your mind around this type of compliance program. And I think in our comments, the listeners were commenting that, to even set up a compliance program like that, sort of a robust, AI governance thing, it just costs so much. It's cost prohibitive. Small companies cannot do that. It's like they can't afford it, things like that. So
Yeah, I think on the data side, there's some really interesting models there from the health sector. So genetics, for example, where in the UK, and I don't know about other countries, but certainly in the UK, we have a bank of genetic data that companies and anybody, researchers, whatever, can access, providing they meet certain thresholds. So we've got some models like that we could use and move forward with, rather than thinking we've got to start everything from scratch and don't know how it's done. But it needs the will from different parties to do that, and the drive to come, I guess, from the government. So the government in the UK have said that they're going to regulate, that they're going to bring forward some legislation to be clearer than the previous government were. This new Labour government has said that they want to put legislation together. So that's potentially could have something in there that will think about governance of data and how that works. And on the other point, Alyssa, about how difficult it is, we'll touch later on responsible AI. There are some frameworks that are put together that really are much more accessible for small businesses, and there are people out there like myself, like you, that are working to try and make things easy to understand, to strip away some of the jargon so that anybody can access these tools and start to get their approaches to data and AI governance sorted, rather than thinking, oh, I don't know how to do it, I'll just wait till there's legislation. So yeah, we'll give some hope to people that are watching later on that front.
Be optimistic, guys. Speaking of optimism, so Sue, the new Labour Party.
Yeah.
Let's talk about that and its brand new or not so brand new vision of how AI will take the UK forward, and it will conquer the world or be just the best of the best, or
Yeah.
how does that play out?
Well, it's really interesting. So there's I mentioned Lord Chris Holmes. So he's a member of the House of Lords. So he's not in the government. And he, before with the previous government, he brought forward a private members bill on AI regulation. And it's possible, but exceedingly rare, for a private members bill from the House of Lords to actually become law. It just doesn't really happen. But it's a really great way to raise the profile of an issue. So what Chris Holmes does was he put this bill together and then talked about it and raised the profile and got it discussed in Parliament. And he's an amazing guy. He's a Paralympian, and he has guts and drive and passion for this area. So it was a shame that the bill ran out of time when the previous government called the election. But since the new government's come to power, he's really carried on pressing the new government on their plans to regulate AI, and he's really encouraging them to have a principles-based approach, and he's taken to heart points that you would appreciate on intellectual property. You're making sure that creative people, for example, musicians, writers, artists, are rewarded for their products, their labor, rather than it just being absorbed into great big foundation models and disappearing into them. So the Labour government here have said that they want to balance innovation and protection. So yeah, we get that. And they promised that they're going to consult on new legislation. And just yesterday, the Secretary of State for Science, Innovation and Technology, a guy called Peter Kyle, promised some big tech companies he was meeting, I think it was Apple, Google, Microsoft and Meta, that the new regulations, he said, will not become a Christmas tree. What did he mean by that? I think what he meant was ever multiplying branches, just trying to cover everything that might be going on with AI. So instead, I think what he's saying, and my readout, is that we're going to get a consultation starting in the next few weeks, followed by a bill perhaps as soon as the end of the year, which will make its way through Parliament. And it's going to focus on foundation models. So it's going to keep that as its focus rather than the Christmas tree trying to do everything. And it may possibly put into law the voluntary commitments that big tech companies made at the Bletchley Park Summit last November to subject their models to testing and not to release models that could have a severe impact that can't be mitigated. So if it just does that, that's not a bad start. Certainly nowhere near as comprehensive as the EU AI Act, but it would be a decent start for the UK, I think.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned the voluntary commitments. It looks like the big tech companies, last year was the year for the voluntary commitments, because not only they made them at the Bletchley Park, but they also made them following the presidential executive order in 2023. And there are 7 companies making 8 commitments. And I think there was a discussion yesterday on LinkedIn as well, because it was exactly a year since they, I think they even made those commitments before the executive order. So basically, they made those voluntary commitments. Those all the big guys, the 7, the mighty 7, like OpenAI, all these guys. And MIT Technology Review actually looked into those commitments and just trying to analyze what has been done, because it's been a year. And in the AI world, a year is a very long time because so many things can happen. And basically, I mean, the conclusion, not surprising. I mean, not much. So I think it's probably very important to declare things these days, in these early days. But yeah,
good for business. Don't forget.
Sure, because there's also in the US. I mean, we also have this slew of lawsuits, right? So there was a time just a few months ago when basically not even 2 weeks went by before someone was suing OpenAI, right? So it was kind of like becoming anecdotal at some point. It's like 2 weeks and there's another, OpenAI lawsuit. So yeah, I guess we're gonna see how that's gonna happen. Yeah, so just interesting stuff, but it's kind of hard for me to predict what's.
We don't know what's going to happen, but I guess if we can be our skeptical best selves, really, and look at the pattern of things that have happened in the past, I've got to admit, I have been a lobbyist in the past. A chunk of my career was spent in government relations, working for either groups of businesses in a membership organisation or working for a specific business at a time that was employing me. So I know the way the system works, and that people will go into the various different policymakers and ministers and institutes and try to influence them so that whatever gets created by the new government fits their agenda and doesn't stop them doing what they think they're going to get competitive advantage from. So that's the real world as it is. Things that worry me is that lots of these institutes and organizations don't have the same level of skills. So time was not that long ago where if you'd done a computer science master's degree or a PhD, PhDs in particular, 70% of PhDs in computer science carried on in academia and 30% worked in industry. Now, switch the other way around. 70% of computer science and AI related PhDs are now in industry and only 30% in academia. So that leaves a gap. If you're wanting as an institute or a civil servant, whatever, to bring in people who've got talent and knowledge, you're probably going to have to go to industry to get those skills rather than being able to pull people out of academia to help and support you. So regulatory capture, that's what happens when the tech companies have the people, have the skills, and therefore determine what the outcomes are. So it goes back to that point we mentioned earlier on with the EU, that it is up to all of us to try to get involved with these processes, to try to have a say and to influence them, so long as the policymakers are listening to everybody and don't just get fixated on the big tech companies because they're big and powerful. I think also it's looking at AI safety and risk is quite captivating for lots of these policymakers. So we at Bletchley Park Summit last year was all about existential risk and the headline grabbing stuff. I was reading over the few weeks recently Ray Kurzweil's recent book, The Singularity is Nearer. You know, he's forecasting that by the 2040s, our brains are going to be merged with technology. But he didn't really answer the questions of how we make a future that uses technology to benefit humanity. It was more a sort of hope and expectation that was going to happen. And I think that's the point of, or should be the point to me, of these discussions like the summit in Seoul, which has just happened in May, the France summit next February. We need to be setting up things that aren't just based on hope and wishful thinking. And we'll see the French have been much more, less interested in existential risk, thinking there's a lot of hype there. So we'll see if they are focusing on more practical issues rather than some of the big existential risk issues. But it'll be interesting to see how that plays out.
Yeah, this is precisely when we started this talk series last year with Elena, this is precisely what we wanted to talk about, because the existential, topics are very tempting. I mean, you could just drown in them. I mean, all this amazing literature that's out there and, that you could talk about and just, as my 12-year-old son says, I do not want AI to become sentient very soon, right? So, but this is exactly the issues that we wanted to discuss during our talk series, is like more practical, issues staring us at the face right now. So something that we could actually do, because I feel like, and even just generally in life, when you're looking at the bigger picture and you're thinking about that, big goal, sometimes you feel really helpless because you think there is no way I will be able to do that. I mean, there's no point in doing anything. But when you actually break up that huge process, the goal into like incremental, steps, and you just kind of move along and you achieve this little goal, and then you move on to the next one, and you move on to the next one, this entire, there's a kind of a light at the end of the tunnel, this entire, elephant in the room, it doesn't seem as unattainable anymore, right? So it just feels like, I felt this way about the bar exam, in California. It just seemed like a huge goal to achieve, and it was very daunting to me. But as soon as I broke it up in like really like weekly goals, it just became a little more manageable. So I'm thinking about these existential AI risks, which can be like very, it just makes you feel like, what can I do? Who am I? Like, what's my purpose here, right? Yeah. But if you actually think about, your organization, what you can do like today or maybe like in 6 months, then I think it just becomes more real. And this is the goal of our talk. Yeah. So thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah, I agree. At the end of the day, we don't live in a sci-fi novel, unfortunately, as much as many of us wanted to, probably, right? We live in the real world, and unfortunately, we have to face the consequences that are in the real world, and they affect real people on the daily basis. And a lot of the times, those real people are not even aware that AI, in any shape, way, or form, affected their lives and their livelihoods, right? And going forward, it's going to be even more of an issue. So that's why we here, and every single time we're trying to, open up this discussion and start this discussion and just get more insights from just brilliant people such as you are. So, just
Yeah. So
otherwise,
should we get into the detail then on the
definitely,
and give people some real stuff they can take away and do tomorrow? So, responsible AI is not a phrase that I coined. Lots of people have talked about it over the years, but it's the phrase I use to try and express how we can actually think about what we're doing with AI, the impact it's going to have. And I find a lot of leaders are really baffled by this whole area. And exactly as you were both saying there, they need it broken down into steps that they can follow. So that's why I've got this responsible AI framework, which is what I use with clients. And it's not, as I'm saying earlier on, it's not just about being nice, an airy fairy. It's actually good for business. So IBM have done some research. It found that when organizations focus on the ethics of what they're using generative AI for, those that do that are 27% more likely to outperform on revenue growth than companies that don't. So IBM have characterized this, saying that those who tread carefully will get farther faster. They're going to avoid pitfalls, they're going to build customer trust. And when those are priorities for chief executives, they're in it for the long haul rather than just doing something quickly and hoping they get away with it and nobody notices. So this responsible AI framework, it's when you talk about responsible AI, lots of people think about transparency and explainability. When do we tell people what we're doing and what do we tell them? And they might think about bias and discrimination, and they're probably going to think about data privacy and security. But lots of the other things that are on these 7 points here get missed out. And that's my frustration. So I put this framework together to say to people, actually, this is what we need to look at. Responsible AI is not, it is enlightened self-interest. It's not just about complying with regulation and avoiding litigation. It means you can plan for the long term and not just what you can do today. So quickly whizzing through them in order, the accountability point, that's all about saying, who's going to make these complex decisions? Now, who's going to recognize that there's an ethical choice to be made? Who's actually going to decide, do we use artificial intelligence in a certain use case or do we not? And some organizations say to me, oh, well, I'm the chief executive. I'm going to make those decisions. And I say, okay, you could, but what experience do you have? How do you know you're taking all the different impacts into account? So then you might say, okay, well, we'll do an impact assessment for the particular AI tool, and we'll think about social impacts, and we'll think about risk. Yeah, right, okay, now we're getting to look at accountability. Now we're really thinking about how we do that. And of course, the enlightened chief executive at that point goes, I can't do all that on my own. I need a team of people that are going to be bringing all this together. And that's really important, to have that cross-functional team, sometimes involving people from outside the organization. Customers, they could be really useful to have a say in that sort of framework. One of my clients is a really innovative entrepreneurial business. They don't have any committees at all in that business. So if I said to them, hey, a great way to have this governance framework would be to say, have an AI ethics committee. Doesn't fit with the way they work. They have no committees for anything. So that doesn't work there. Whereas other organizations, banks, for example, have set up some really good AI ethics committees because it works within their structure. So it's all about being really flexible about how you do it. Areas like human agency and oversight, again, sometimes we want to make sure there's human agency being respected. We might need a human in the loop, a human on the loop, some other way of intervening in a process. The technical side, usually I find tech teams have got that pretty well covered from the pure technical side. But when they're thinking about safety, they're thinking about cybersecurity, technical safety, and not thinking about the socio-technical side and what impact does this have on people. So we bring that into the discussion. As I say, privacy and data governance, I find most businesses and public sector organizations and charities as well have got that sorted pretty well. Diversity, non-discrimination and fairness, it's just a huge topic, absolutely massive. And too many people get caught up thinking they're about the sorts of biases that we look at in society. And they forget they also need to look at statistical biases, because some types of social bias are just there. It's in our data. We can't get rid of it. What we need to work out is it statistically significant? Does it actually make a difference to the way we treat people in our data set? Sometimes it does, and we need to do something about that. Sometimes it doesn't. And then the last one, social and environmental well-being. There's lots of things we could do with AI, but it might disadvantage a particular group. It might change society. As that tax employer example I gave, is it shifts power too much away from people. And then the environment side, we are starting to see now that some more foundation models are being created that really recognize using too much energy is not a good thing. So they're being built to use less energy. And that's a positive sign and a good step in the right direction. Apple recently put out a paper about a new way that they're working, and they're open sourcing, which is interesting to see. And they are really paying attention to the environmental impact of the model that they built as well. So hopefully for some people watching, that responsible AI framework just gives them some real tools they can go away and use in real life.
Yeah, no, 100%. And we were talking about the standards. So the new ISO IC standards, they also mentioned the ecological implications and environmental impact of those models, right? So, but obviously these are just standards and everything is voluntary again, but at least there's some talk of that as well. So for companies who are developing that, it's very advisable to take that into consideration. So, I mean, I take that as a win.
Yeah, I think so. And it's about demonstrating the organization's values, isn't it? We might say that we're going to, I don't know, be carbon neutral by 2030 as an organization. And if you're saying that, you've got to demonstrate that in the way you use AI as well. You can't just say, oh, well, it's generative AI. I have to use this tool and forget the fact that it's blown a hole in my carbon neutral ambitions. So you've got to link the two together, and how we treat employees, how we treat customers as well. We need to be transparent, for example, about how we're using AI. And really fascinating piece of work that's been done by a team at Bristol University, just up the road from where I am in the UK. They've looked over a period of 3 years about the language that a particular company could use to explain how they're using AI when they're dealing with some of the most disadvantaged communities. So, we might explain an AI use case in a way that works for all of us that are on this session today, but it might not work for communities that are actually trying to buy the goods and services from the company. So adapting our language, explaining how we're doing things is really important. And in the UK, in financial services recently, we've just had to do the first round of reporting on what's called consumer duty. So again, shifting power away from some of the big financial services organizations to the consumer, so that companies have to, for example, communicate in ways and times that people can understand. So that's now a duty when you're in a regulated financial services organization in the UK. But it's kind of common sense, isn't it? If we want to build trust with customers, if we want to build trust with employees, then why aren't we already using language they understand and talking to them in times and places that suit them? But again, it's power, isn't it? We as the organization make the decisions and don't necessarily ask others how they want to be dealt with. So yeah, this whole framework really is about acknowledging that we can do harm with these tools, whether it's to our own companies, to our own organizations, to wider society, and then really seeking to minimize that harm.
Yeah, I was just gonna say that I think for the longest time, right, since just the start of the World Wide Web, blah blah blah, so social media companies, all the kind of the Magnificent Seven that Elisa mentioned, we kind of at this point we started before the LLMs appeared, just ChatGPT, to be precise, right, in 2023, at the end of 2023, we kind of all took it as just a given. So okay, we have those huge big tech companies, they develop all the new tech and stuff, they got this also. Kind of what power do we have as just regular people, right? We're here on Earth, they're somewhere just in the different universe, so what can we do? But I think what we're dealing with today is obviously it's LLMs and just this technology in general, just foundation models, they essentially democratize this field of who has a say in what. And we are still a lot of the times in this mindset, okay, what can I do? Yeah, but I'm just me. It's just me. It's just me, a small person. A lot of people that I've been talking to, everybody has a feeling that they need a computer and science degree to be able to talk about those things. Like, why should anyone listen to my voice when I don't know really anything about how this tech works, or any of this stuff, versus that's precisely why we need your voice and your input, because this technology is for everyone. It's everywhere. And essentially, like you said, it's only common sense that everyone has a say in it, and people should not be afraid to express their point of view, be it just anything. Every point of view is valuable. It doesn't matter whether you have a computer science degree or not.
I absolutely agree with you, but I do find too many organizations where they will not listen to people that don't have the, doctor so and so before their name, or professor such and such, and
but still,
yeah, absolutely. So but my message to people is always, don't let that hold you back. Still ask questions. And one area where we can all ask questions and have an impact is when we're buying in these AI-based tools, whether it's the latest version of ChatGPT, or whether it's a machine learning model that's fairly straightforward. Ask questions of suppliers of those tools. What does the tool do? What data was it trained on? How do I know it's going to work in my specific situation, that my data is similar enough to how it's been trained? So ask, in other words, for the suppliers of those tools, who are going to be making a lot of money out of all of us, to explain themselves and to train. So I'm working with some very big global tech organizations at the moment, saying to them that they have a duty not just to sell their stuff out to all of us, but to explain and to educate all of us. So they're bringing people up to a new level of understanding and confidence in asking those questions and understanding the answers. And that ranges, as we were saying, environmental impact. How much impact does this tool have on the environment? And I've done that recently with a guy who was trying to convince me to buy a particular service and a particular tool. And I said, explain to me how you calculated the environmental impact of this tool. He didn't have an explanation. Well, I'm not buying it. Go away and get me that information, and I'll think about buying. So that we as consumers have to recognize we've got power, and we have to choose to use it. I think that's so important for us to feel that power, and not just say, well, I have to use the tool, and I'm not allowed to ask why and how it works.
Yeah, exactly. Sue, I mean, you definitely, for me, it really hits the nail on the head, because two things, like consumers and education. And also I'm thinking about younger generation we're living in this world already. So I feel like, you're saying companies have a duty, to explain, to educate the customers. And I feel like we also have a duty as a society to just kind of introduce some sort of education starting as early as in middle school. I feel like middle school and high school, and because this is the generation of consumers that are going to use this tech. They're already using it, and this is going to be part of their lives, as it was when the generation started to use the internet, and it's just we're living in right now. So this is where they're going to be. And I completely agree. I as a consumer, I try to educate myself on things, and there are certain issues that are important to me, right? So it might be not important to somebody else, but still I do have the power, it's called the power of a dollar, or pound or euro, because I choose what products I will be spending my money on. And exactly, so if the company is selling something using third-party technology from third-party vendors, they don't really know what that is. I would like, at least in my high level, I'm not an engineer, but I can grasp some of those concepts just fine. So I would like to understand. And I guess, I mean, I don't know if that's a digression from the kind of governance, our governance topic today, but probably not, because, I mean, this is something that is very human and kind of a common sense thing, right? So if you're selling a product, you should understand what the product is, right? So
absolutely.
But you have built and explained to other people in simple terms without the marketing buzz, right?
Yeah, exactly. Because we can all create something that's baffling and nobody understands it. That's not clever.
That's the easy part.
Yeah, exactly. The clever thing is to be able to take a complex idea and a concept and put it in language that everyone can understand. And that's what I always say to leaders is that, don't be baffled by what's going on around you. Dig and ask questions, because this stuff's been created by humans, and therefore we as humans can understand it. If we ever get to the point of the singularity when the AI is creating itself and it's all more intelligent than us, then yeah, okay, it's going to leave us behind. But that's not where we are today. So focusing on what we can actually do today, we can get more knowledge, we can ask questions and demand those answers so that we're satisfied before we use our power as consumers that it's actually doing the right thing.
Yeah.
I have nothing to add.
I think this is a great way to conclude, I guess, our discussion today. And Sue, thank you so much for joining us from the UK. And it's been a pleasure.
Yeah. Thank you guys for just being so engaged. Obviously, we kind of hit the right tone today. I don't know if it's the stars, the AI Act into force, whatever it is. I mean, it's been truly a pleasure, and we are so honored to have had the opportunity to talk to you, Sue, because these issues are really something that has to be talked about every day. And I would love for other people to kind of join the discussion, either in the comment section or just message us, or Sue, if you would like to kind of just continue the discussion, or you're interested just, in talking about or exploring some business opportunities as well. So a little plug for everyone.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I just wanted to say that, as Lena mentioned earlier, we have our talks kind of on a bi-weekly basis. At least we try to keep that this way. And our next one will be in a couple of weeks. So if you'd like to join, stay tuned. We will announce on LinkedIn as usual. And thank you for joining today.
So much. Thanks, everyone. See you next time.